saying, well, we want to know the answers to these things. But the clue is in the name that this is the Local Government Water Services Preliminary Arrangements Bill. So it's preliminary. There's another one to come. The first stage, if we remind us, was the repeal of the previous government's Three Waters proposal. Then there's this stage, and then there's another one which was quite clearly signalled in this bill that will come at the end of this year. And I just wanted to briefly remind ourselves about that first stage, the repeal of the previous government's legislation, because I think in this debate there's been a little bit of reinvention of history. We heard a bit of that reinvention of history from the Honourable Kieran McNulty before. There were less than 200 submissions on this bill. There were, how many was it? 87,000 on Labor's legislation, and that wasn't because people loved it. It was because people didn't like it at all. Look, it's been portrayed, Mr Speaker, as a solution that will fix everything overnight. But look, the reality is it wasn't, and we've heard from the Honourable Kieran McNulty already that it's in some way to blame for rates going up this year, and they're going up across the board. But the reality is that legislation wouldn't have kicked in until, wouldn't be this year, it would be at least next year, if not the year after. So that's not true. And also we've had some people saying that somehow magically there was going to be this magic money tree, and I know that some local body members think there was this magic money tree somehow that was going to pay for water. Well, it wasn't. All that was going to happen is that it was going to be transferred from ratepayers to water consumers, who by and large are the same people, although it would have at least meant renters were paying directly for those services, potentially. We've also heard from Kieran McNulty that 80% of the cost, or 80% of the rates, goes on water and transport. I can tell you certainly in the urban areas it's nowhere near that. I was looking for the rates bill to see if I could actually find the numbers, but I think it wouldn't be a lot more than 50. Mr Speaker, that legislation also appropriated council assets. Appropriated them. They were assets built up by ratepayers over a century and a half, and essentially with no meaningful consultation. Remember, it started out as something they could opt into, councils could opt into. Then it was like, you're going to have to opt out because we'd really like you all to be in there. And it's like, you're going in. You're going in. What sort of an approach is that? And some brave councils, and we've already had my friend Cameron Luxton saying, brave mayors who took on the government on this, and some of them took the government to court, and the court said this was appropriation without compensation. In most cases, you would regard that as theft, is the word that you would use. And it's another example, Mr Speaker, sometimes that we need protection from our own governments. It also created the co-governance model. The co-governance model created two different classes of citizens, and I know that some people have said that as a result of that legislation and other legislation, they did not even feel like they were New Zealanders anymore, and that is terrible. People have said that to me. It also set up a complex form of governance that couldn't possibly be effective and efficient, and it reached so far down into the small rural communities and said, look, we want to appropriate effectively your small rural scheme. Even at one stage, the two houses together was a scheme that they wanted to take over. But the other thing was, it was always far, far too expensive. Right from the beginning, it looked like it was a gold-plated scheme. It was a gold-plated scheme. The numbers that have been talked about there, the $180 to $185 billion, I'm confident, as a result of the three stages that we're going through, that it will be well south of that. Much, much cheaper to deliver the water services. The other thing I wanted to comment on, because it came up also in the Committee of the Whole House, was the concern about the scrapping that's been done of the Future for Local Government Review. Remember that? The Future for Local Government Review, let's be very, very clear, that was an afterthought from the previous government, only in response to local government, only because local government saying, hey, you're taking the water away, you're taking away the RMA responsibility, so what are we going to be doing? And so for many local authorities, that was an existential threat. So let's just be clear about that. And the other thing that review, of course, did is it focused only on what local government did. And some of us actually asked at the time to say, actually, could you focus on all forms of public service and say what fits where best? What's best at central, regional, local, or even community level? So what does this bill do? Well, it sorts out the borrowing issues for water care in Auckland. It leaves much more control with councils to sort out the structures, the financing, the service delivery and some of the standards, and that matters. We've had some of our communities say that they, for example, don't want chlorine in their water. Those kind of things do matter to people. What stormwater levels do they want? Are we looking at 1 in 20-year flood, 1 in 100-year flood, 1 in 500-year flood? Those things matter. What about the receiving water quality in waterways? Those things matter as well. During the Committee of the House, it also makes it easier to set up CCOs alone or together. And during the Committee of the House, we heard concerns about that being only one consultation process rather than two. And all I would say is just make it authentic. That's the key bit, is to make it an authentic process, because I've seen a lot of tick box consultation in the past, and that does nothing for anybody. It doesn't matter whether you do it once, twice or 10 times. It is still a waste of time. Then it requires a water service delivery plan. And have a look at what's in the bill, because what is not to like about those things? A description of the current state of the water services network sounds sensible. A description of the current levels of water services provided. That sounds very sensible as well. I'm not going to go through all of them. The financial projections, a description of the asset management approach. Boy, that's a good one. That's one I like, because I like asset management. An explanation of how the revenue from and delivery of water services will be separated. All of those things are really, really important. It gives a lot more transparency than we've got at the moment, because at the moment we don't have that level of transparency. I want to come back to those water standards. The bill also includes, and we've already heard that referenced, the removing of Te Mana o Te Wai. Now, Te Mana o Te Wai sounded really, really good, because you want to look after the water, you want to do high-quality water. I had a regional council the other day, not from this region, but a regional council tell me the other day that they are aiming for drinking water quality standard in all of their rivers. I'd just like you to understand that thinking and whether that's even possible. Whether that's even possible. And if you did, what you would have to do. That seemed just completely nuts. So there are concerns there. The problem with Te Manawa Te Wai is you've got three levels there. And what I've seen in resource management processes is that it's only the top one that counts. For many decision makers, it's only the top one that counts. And so the ones behind it, the health needs of people. And then the ability of people and communities to provide for our social, economic and cultural well-being, those things are subjugated to Te Manawa Te Wai. So that's why, Mr Speaker, that has come out. Now, Mr Speaker, I talked about asset management. Some people argue that councils haven't done a good job of managing assets, and actually I think it's fair. But I think that central government needs to be very careful that it is not in a glass house when it is throwing stones, because for many parts of the central government asset portfolio, if you like, there is no asset management plan. And we lurch from crisis to crisis saying, oh, goodness me, there's a hospital that needs fixing because it's got mould all over the place. There are schools which are falling down. You know, those things. And how do we do it? We cash fund them. So I think central government central government should not be the pot calling the kettle black and needs to get its own house in order of that, and that's something which we ought to be thinking very carefully about. Now, if there was, Mr Speaker, a real concern about underfunding, that thing of renewals versus depreciation, I ask a question. That was going on for years in every council around the country, and I know I was a part of a council that was doing it as well. And I asked a question at the Governance and Administration Select Committee saying to the Office, the Auditor General, saying, well, how many big red flags did you raise? Crickets. Not many. And so I would say to the OAG in this process, and also the ComCom in this process, be waving big red flags if you think there is a concern about the asset management, the way in which those important assets are being looked after. Mr Speaker, just to finish off with, this bill to me makes water delivery and investment much more transparent than it has ever been before, and that is a really good thing. It puts greater oversight there, so the Commerce Commission will be involved, and I think that's something that will be very interesting for councils to be exposed to. It allows for government-appointed assistance in developing water plans when necessary. And can I just actually also add one other thing, because we had a lot about the cost of delivery. Now, obviously, the changes around Te Manawa Te Wai are going to make a difference there. The other one is that the changes that have been made outside of the water system to things like temporary traffic management. And you might go, what the heck's that got to do with it? But I've had chief executives of council saying 40%, I've said this in the House before, 40% of the cost of every piece of work on the roads is traffic management. If you can halve that, you can go back and have a bit of a think about that and say, well, that's going to really reduce the cost of delivering our water services. So those things are really important. So, look, Mr Speaker, I am really confident that the reform through this bill and the forthcoming legislation will make the delivery of the three waters more reliable, more robust. It'll still give us good quality systems. It will be done locally, and it will be done for much less than the previous government system. And I commend this bill to the House.
So there's good old Uncle Andy. Does it feel like he's trying to take a bob each way?
Yes, it sounds like a very political kind of answer, and obviously from the other side of the bench, obviously. But I think the thing is that the council should be left independently to run, and that the whole purpose of this new national-led coalition was to have a devolution and returning local democracy back to the council. So in that sense, I mean, if kind of the new legislation does it help that? I mean, do you guys think that it does return and devolve rather than one big gargantuan monolith controlled by a Politburo? Or sorry, just use the word.
Yeah. For those in the comments who have said Uncle Andy, my friend Matthew Salter went to of college. Matthew's mother is Andy's sister. Just for those who are wondering where the Uncle Andy comment does come from. There is a reason behind that, and it's because one of my college best friends is actually Andy's nephew. So, just for those who are just reading in there, Uncle Andy.
I thought we only gave terms like uncle and auntie to people we liked.
I don't know. Andy's in a bit of a weird one. I mean, you've got to remember, he at least somewhat supported into the ballot where other candidates felt a bit short, such as Tamara Paul from Wellington Central.
He was also the one who got up and told a reporter that she should really be thanking him for trying to ban trans people from sports.
Oh, God, this was after the election, obviously.
Yes. Yeah. So there's some interesting things there. His claim, though, that that they gave the power back to the councils is one of those technically accurate things, because they did give water management back to councils. after the councils had been told to take it out of their budgets. So some of those increases that we're seeing in infrastructure, a large chunk of that is suddenly having to deal with water infrastructure again that they weren't having to deal with before. If you take somewhere like the Far North District Council, they have not got the rating base to be able to pay for the upgrades on those assets that he was talking about in their water supply, which are coming up 90 years old. They need to be replaced to be fit for purpose. And if they're not, that's when you have things like chlorine added to water because you're not getting, you need to clear those contaminants from that older system. So it all sort of feeds into the fact that the government turned around at the very start of their term, 10 months ago and said, right, councils, you have water supplies back on there. You have to pay for everything again. For some councils like Far North District Council, that was a nearly 30% rates increase for people if they had gone ahead with the planned water infrastructure upgrades that they needed. So those costs are definitely ones that the government has put back onto councils when it comes to water supply. But then the other twist that they have, the other angle that this government uses is we're going to make it cheaper. And we saved Auckland 26% rates increases in their water supply. But that would have been 17 to 18% under Three Waters. But it was only going to go back up to that 25% rate because the government made Watercare and Auckland Council take back those resources and start charging for it again. It's we're saving you from the problem we caused ourselves. And it's just such a typical arrogant attitude from this government. We're saving you from yourselves that we put you in danger in the first place.
I mean, also like the fact that they, in the case of Auckland, they removed the Auckland Regional Fuel Tax, which Wayne Brown was going, actually, if you remove it, I've got to put rates up by 7.5% just to cover the budget shortfall.
Yep.
And the regional fuel tax was more user pay than putting up the rates. Like, put it this way, when I was up in Auckland doing It's in the Ballot, I happily paid into the Auckland Regional Transport Fund when I bought petrol at Gull Onehunga. I had no problem with that. It was the cheapest one on the way out to Auntie Gwen's house in New Lynn. But the thing is, I've got no problem paying that. What I don't like paying is like the $2.80 a litre at my local Z in Constable Street, where I can pay $2.40 at Waitomo and Tawa. That's one thing I don't like, but the government don't want to sort out that.
Right.
Sorry to take it off from water to petrol taxes.
Deep breath,
I'm actually asking a question. Maybe you guys can answer this for me. So the whole purpose of Three Waters initially, right, was to conglomerate everything together so that they could help redistribute some funds to help the poorer regions. Was that what was the main thrust of it? Means like Kaikoura or whatever. I mean, like the hinterlands.
A mini version of Three Waters is called of an entity is Wellington Water, and a more massive version you could say is Watercare in Auckland, because I think Watercare was around before the amalgamation of Auckland Council.
Yeah, I believe so.
Yeah, and Wellington Water is the same concept. And I do know when I lived on the Kapiti Coast, Greater Wellington Regional Council wanted to get water source from the Otaki River, but Kapiti Coast District Council didn't want to be part of the predecessor of Wellington Water. But one of the things it would have done was one particular water shortage on the Kapiti Coast would have been averted if we were part of that scheme. And I think 8 years later, there was a water shortage in Wellington, and that would have been averted if we were part of that scheme. In the other direction, because the Otaki River does have quite a it's a high and a wide river. And it's of the Kapiti Coast rivers, it's the one that has the most water flowing down it, but it also has quite a tiny community compared to the rest of the district to feed a water supply. So it was one that could be on there. And so, but we've seen a Three Waters entity in action known as Wellington Water, and well, it's a bit questionable the way how they're doing it, but then at the same time, the Three Waters entity of Wellington Water ain't quite what was proposed as Three Waters. It's an example that you can look at, and the downside is it's gone down a corporatisation model that basically isn't being held accountable to its governance board. It's got a weird system. It's got a councillor board, which is typically mayors, which is the shareholders. Then it's got another board underneath it. Then it's got a chief executive, and trickles down that way. And it's quite a weird structure the way Wellington Water works. The fact that it's got technically two boards that confuses things. And typically the people who sit on the boards are usually the mayors, but that's not always the case. But it has, I think at the moment, I think that all are mayors except for the regional council, because regional councils don't have mayors, they have chairs, but I don't know who does the regional councils one.
I mean, having explained that, I mean, could it be that why there was such a strong opposition to Three Waters? I mean, well, for those who don't agree, I mean, at that time, with so many submissions, was because of they felt that it was more of concentrating too much power into, maybe just to help the Wellingtonians, who's made a mess of their 6 years of look at so many burst pipes every day, nearly every other day.
I mean,
story in Wellington.
If we want to look at that, you can look at Andy's voting record for the last 30 years of Wellington City Council. I mean, Andy's part of that problem of low rates and all that sort of thing, which was a progressive thing over there. And I mean, Wellington's come out of it. Hutt's had its issues. I mean, a lot of the issue of Wellington is the fact the pipes are just so old. Yeah.
So it's a shared responsibility, I guess, for not.
Well, I mean, because like most of our water in Wellington comes from Timaru and Upper Hutt, right. And it goes via Porora City Council on its way to Wellington, because the Porora City Council way is less earthquake. I think it's more stable because there is a earthquake fault line between Petone and Wellington City that is on a fault line. So that's the reason why the water goes up across the Hutt River, up over the Haywoods into Porora, and then goes down another pipe into Wellington while feeding Porora at the same time. It's quite a convoluted thing there. But it makes sense why we have a Wellington Water in Wellington. It makes sense why we have that structure, because we are doing four city councils are being provided.
Right.
And in terms of those complaints that he mentioned that came through, it's also really important to note that the vast majority of those were copy and paste complaints that came from specific organizations, like the Taxpayers Union, for example. They drove this really hard. There are a number of organizations whose main complaint was co-governance. And it was very much race baiting and very much designed to push this narrative of coming to give your stuff to the Maoris. And it was so disingenuous and so racist, but that is a large chunk of what this country is. There are organizations out there who will push that button really specifically, knowing it's going to get people worked up. So it is really important to note that the vast majority of those complaints aren't individual. Like, people haven't thought about them. They've just gone, I'm angry, grr, send. And it means that the kind of feedback that you're getting isn't helpful.
And that was actually evident. We were in Tauranga doing the local bodies. The Ratepayers Alliance promoted us because we had all these shows and we were videoing and all that. The most common complaint that was sent to the Ratepayers Alliance was there was too many Māori questions. And it's quite funny. They sent us a template of questions that mirrored the template that another member from the Ratepayers Association sent us. That was in the question boxes. And I think some of them were hard-hitting questions. But our aim was trying to have a variety of questions so that people, got a good understanding of answers, because everything wasn't just about the long-term plan and the rates. There were other random little issues.
I thought I had an understanding. I mean, that the issue was more, Paul, your point is quite well taken, but I thought the issue was more that the Maori side of the Three Waters, right, was not elected. They were selected. So that went against the democratic.
None of the three water boards were elected, which I think may be a mistake. But I mean, that's also the case with Auckland CCOs. Like, I do know that once I think New Zealand First has put a bill to dissolve Auckland Transport and put it back to the councillors. But why aren't you doing it to Watercare? Why aren't you doing it to all the CCOs? The problem isn't just Auckland Transport. It's all the CCOs have the same problem. I mean, Penny Bright used to call, she said the most transparent one was Auckland Transport of all the CCOs. So, what does that tell you? If you want to dissolve the most transparent CCO, what are you going to do with the least transparent ones, like Watercare? Or, I can't remember what the names are. She was brilliant on what she did. It's a shame she's not around now, because she would be sitting there making absolute mincemeat of transparency, because that was her big thing.
So let me just talk about that for a second, Eric. Let me just deal with the democracy thing here for you. For a start,
Yes.
we already have co-governance models and have had them in this country for over 30 years, looking
Right.
after places like the volcanic peaks around Auckland and the Waikato River. And those aren't elected positions either. The board was never going to be made up of people who were voting for that board. It was always going to be made up of people who are representing the council and people who are representing iwi interests. There was never a point where you were going to be voting on your ballot for Joe Bloggs to represent me in this particular Three Waters entity. That was not the case. But the idea was to make sure that you had two partners who were agreed to in the treaty that founded this country, having a co-arrangement in how you look after a particular piece of infrastructure or a particular resource. So making sure that you have iwi on there means that you have a long-term outlook on how you look after something and what you want those outcomes to be. And we've seen that with the mountains in Auckland, and we've seen that with the Waikato River. And having your council representatives on there mean that you have issues that come up from an elected perspective, that come up from a governance perspective in councils and regions, also being seen to in a short-term focus that get brought to the table. So by marrying the two of them so that you have them combined, you have somebody looking out long-term who has a vested interest in making sure that things are handed down. You have somebody who's looking at things short-term, making sure that everything can happen right now at the same time. And you have compromise in the middle by making sure that everybody feels represented and heard, and having multiple voices around the table give you better outcomes in the decision-making process.
And how do you decide about the iwis then? I mean, you have like so many Maori tribes, and everyone will say, hey, how about mine? How about mine? And the next moment you have like 30, 40 tribes, nothing wrong with that. And they probably have to select of, like who wants to be the king of the whole group. And then, and where's the representative democratic side of it?
Same problem with councils. If you look at the entity for Central Waikato, for example, there was something like 16 councils and only 5 positions on that board for councils. They were not all going to get a chance to be represented on. And that's, I don't think, a good thing. I think everybody should have a voice around that. And because of the way that Three Waters was structured, it was very much there will be 10 board members, 5 from iwi, 5 from councils. I think one of the changes that they could have made was, look, there are 16 councils in this area, a representative from each of them. And there are 7 iwi, a representation from each of them as well. So it's one person representing these specific groups. But then you have a board that's got 25 members on it. So that becomes unwieldy, that becomes expensive. You end up with a top-heavy organization where your funds are going to places that they shouldn't go, which is why it was narrowed down to that limit of 10 each. You're never going to find a model that pleases everybody, but the model that Three Waters proposed with their co-governance model was one that was probably the best compromise that you were going to get without having everybody sit there screaming racism, which is what ended up happening when you had organizations like the Free Speech Union, Taxpayers Union, Groundswell getting behind them and screaming about the color of people's skin over the need for safe water supplies.
Yeah, you were saying there's 16 councils, right, Paul? So why can't the 16 councils elect someone from there? Like really elected person, and also, well, in the Maori side, I guess, so that then people will feel that, that they are truly representative. They will take away the racism.
Would you like your water supply to be controlled by somebody who is there because they were popular, or controlled by somebody who knows what they're doing?
Right. Well, I mean, both. Someone who gets elected who knows what they're doing.
Now, the one part is interesting here is what Takota Ferris has actually pointed out, because some of the stuff that used to have debated going over, Takota Ferris actually sums up very nicely.